In the harsh Dakota Territory of 1873, Willa James sits in the town's only church, her pregnant belly straining against her worn black dress. The preacher's wife whispers behind her fan about the charitable arrangement she's orchestrated, pairing the destitute widow with Bo McKenna, the broken cowboy who once rode broncs like thunder across the plains. The townspeople snicker at what they see as divine comedy, two damaged souls bound together by pity and circumstance. Bo wheels himself to the altar, his weathered hands gripping the chair that's become his horse, his eyes holding storms that haven't broken yet. Willa doesn't flinch when she sees him. She sees past the chair, past the town's cruel joke, to the man who still carries the heart of a rider. But when that flood comes roaring down from the mountains, threatening everything they've built together, will Bo find a way to ride again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind never stopped blowing in Clearwater, Dakota Territory. It carved the faces of the living and polished the bones of the dead, carrying with it the scent of prairie grass, dust, and dreams deferred. Willa James had learned to read that wind like scripture. When it came from the north, it brought snow and hardship. From the south, it whispered promises that rarely kept. She stood at the window of the cramped room above Henley's general store, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other cradling the swell of her belly. 7 months along now, and the child seemed eager to make its presence known, kicking against her ribs with the restless energy of someone who'd inherited their father's impatience. Thomas had been like that, always moving, always working, always believing that tomorrow would be better than today. The grain elevator loomed in the distance, a wooden monument to broken promises. 6 months ago, Thomas James had climbed those rickety stairs for the last time, carrying a bag of tools and whistling Sweet Betsy from Pike. The machinery had seized without warning, crushing him beneath gears meant to feed the territory's growing towns. The grain elevator key still hung on a nail by their door, tarnished brass that caught the morning light like a small, cruel joke. Mrs. Cordelia Patterson, the preacher's wife, had appeared at Willa's door 3 days after the funeral, her face arranged in what she considered appropriate sympathy. She wore her Sunday dress, despite it being Tuesday, and her gloves were spotless white, the kind of detail that spoke of a woman who'd never worked a day in her life. "Willa, dear," she'd said, settling herself into Thomas's chair without invitation, "we need to discuss your situation." The situation, as Mrs. Patterson delicately termed it, was simple enough. Willa James was 24 years old, widowed, pregnant, and had exactly $17 to her name. In the harsh mathematics of frontier life, this equation rarely solved itself favorably. "There's a man," Mrs. Patterson had continued, her voice dropping to what she imagined was a conspiratorial whisper. "Bo McKenna. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Willa had heard of him, certainly. Before his accident, Bo McKenna had been something of a legend in these parts, a rider who could stay on any bronc, rope any steer, and charm any woman within 100 miles. They said he'd ridden in Wild West shows, performed for crowds in Chicago and Denver, lived the kind of life that made young men pack their bags and head west with stars in their eyes. That was before Diablo, a black stallion with the disposition of a prairie storm. The horse had launched Bo 20 feet through the air and into a stone wall with enough force to shatter his spine and every dream he'd ever carried. Now Bo McKenna spent his days in a wheelchair, living in a cabin on the outskirts of town, forgotten by the same crowds that had once cheered his name. It would be, Mrs. Patterson had said, smoothing her skirts, a Christian arrangement, beneficial to all parties. The arrangement, as she outlined it, was simple. Bo needed someone to care for him, and Willa needed a provider. The fact that neither party had been consulted on this matter seemed irrelevant to Mrs. Patterson's grand design. She'd already spoken to the preacher about performing the ceremony, already arranged for the cabin to be made suitable, already informed the Ladies' Aid Society that they'd be providing a modest wedding supper. Willa had listened with the patience of a woman who'd learned early that arguing with Mrs. Patterson was like arguing with the wind, possible, but ultimately pointless. When the older woman finished her presentation, Willa simply nodded and said, "When?" Now, 3 days later, she stood in her wedding dress, the same black wool she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, hastily altered to accommodate her growing belly, and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The cabin that would be her new home sat on 5 acres of stubborn prairie, half a mile from the nearest neighbor. Bo had built it himself in better days when his hands were steady and his back was strong. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a well that ran clear even in the driest summers. Thomas had always spoken admiringly of Bo's craftsmanship, the way he'd chosen each log and fitted each joint with the precision of a man who understood that winter showed no mercy to sloppy work. Bo McKenna himself was a different matter entirely. Willa had seen him only twice since his accident. Once at the general store, buying supplies with the grim efficiency of a man who wanted to finish his business and leave, and once at Thomas's funeral, where he'd sat in the back row and left. Before anyone could approach him with well-meaning sympathy. He was 35 years old, though the accident had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. His hair, once the color of sun-dried wheat, had taken on streaks of premature grey. His hands, still strong from years of rope work, bore the calluses of a man who'd had to relearn how to do everything. His eyes, the pale blue of winter sky, held a wariness that Willa recognized, the look of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from life. The wheelchair was well made, crafted by Jorgensen the wheelwright with the same attention to detail he brought to his wagons. The wheels were large enough to handle prairie terrain, the seat cushioned with leather that Bo maintained with the care he'd once given to his saddles. It was a practical machine, built for function rather than comfort, and Bo handled it with the same easy competence he'd once shown with horses. The townspeople of Clearwater had greeted news of the upcoming wedding with reactions ranging from pity to amusement. The charitable saw it as a Christian solution to 2 pressing problems. The less charitable whispered about the wisdom of pairing 2 broken people and placing bets on how long the arrangement would last. Dr. Amos Whitley, who'd attended both Thomas's death and Bo's recovery, had been more direct in his assessment. "That boy's got more fight in him than folks give him credit for," he'd told Willa during one of her prenatal visits. "The accident took his legs, not his spirit, though sometimes I wonder if he knows the difference." The preacher, Reverend Samuel Morrison, had approached the upcoming ceremony with the gravity of a man performing surgery rather than celebrating love. He'd met with both bride and groom separately, explaining the seriousness of the vows they were about to take, the importance of Christian duty in marriage, and the need for patience as they learned to live together. "Marriage," he'd said to Willa, his weathered face creased with concern, "is not about feelings, my dear. It's about commitment, about honoring God through our actions. What you and Mr. McKenna are undertaking is noble, but it will require strength you may not know you possess." The Ladies' Aid Society had thrown themselves into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of women who rarely got to organize anything more exciting than church suppers. They'd cleaned the cabin from floor to ceiling, stocked the pantry with preserves and dry goods, and arranged for Widow Larson to donate a rocking chair that had belonged to her late husband. Martha Henley, whose husband ran the general store, had taken it upon herself to provide Willa with the practical advice she assumed the young woman would need. "A man in his condition," she'd said while helping Willa alter her dress, "well, you'll need to be patient, very patient. There are adjustments to be made." The adjustments, as Martha delicately termed them, encompassed everything from cooking. For someone with different needs, to understanding the peculiar isolation that came with being married to a man the town regarded as an object of pity. Martha had been married to Harold for 27 years and considered herself an expert on the mysteries of male behavior, though she'd never dealt with circumstances quite like these. As the sun climbed higher over Clearwater, casting long shadows across the prairie, Willa gathered her few possessions: Thomas's grain elevator key, her mother's Bible, 2 dresses, and a photograph of her parents taken on their own wedding day. Everything else would remain with the Henleys, who'd been kind enough to let her stay above the store during her pregnancy. The church bell began to toll, calling the town to witness what Mrs. Patterson insisted on referring to as a blessed union. Willa took one last look at herself in the cracked mirror, smoothed her dress over her belly, and stepped out into the Dakota wind. Whatever came next, she thought, could hardly be worse than the loneliness she was leaving behind. The wedding ceremony lasted exactly 11 minutes, which Reverend Morrison later claimed as a personal record for brevity without sacrificing the sacred nature of the occasion. Willa stood beside Beau's wheelchair at the altar, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not from affection, but because the weight of the child made standing for long periods increasingly difficult. Beau had dressed for the occasion in his best: shirt, pressed trousers, and a vest that had seen better days, but still carried the dignity of careful maintenance. Around his waist he wore a belt with silver conchos, and attached to that belt were the spurs he'd worn during his riding days, polished silver with intricate engravings that caught the church's dim light. They served no practical purpose now, but Willa understood their significance. A cowboy's spurs were more than equipment. They were identity, heritage, promise. That Beau had chosen to wear them today spoke of hope, or perhaps defiance. The congregation was smaller than Mrs. Patterson had hoped, but larger than Willa had expected. Most of Clearwater's permanent residents had come, along with a handful of ranchers from the surrounding area who remembered Beau's glory days. They filled perhaps half the church's 20 pews, their faces displaying the careful neutrality that frontier people wore when witnessing events they weren't quite sure how to judge. Dr. Whitley served as witness for the bride, his presence lending medical authority to what some considered a questionable match. Jorgensen the wheelwright stood for Beau, his massive hands folded respectfully, his usually jovial face solemn with the weight of the moment. "Do you, Willa Marie James, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do." The words came steadily, without hesitation, though Willa's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Beau's shoulder. "Do you, Robert Daniel McKenna, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, to protect and provide for, in all circumstances that God may ordain?" Beau's answer came after a pause that stretched just long enough to make Mrs. Patterson shift uncomfortably in her front row seat. "I do." The ring was a simple gold band that had belonged to Beau's mother, sized down by the town's blacksmith to fit Willa's slender finger. As Beau slipped it onto her hand, his fingers were steady, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that had spent decades gripping rope and leather. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Dakota and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Morrison closed his Bible with a snap that echoed through the small church. "You may kiss the bride." This was the moment Willa had dreaded most, not from any revulsion, but from the sheer awkwardness of the situation. Beau looked up at her from his chair, his storm-grey eyes unreadable, and she leaned down to meet him halfway. Their lips touched briefly, formally, the kind of kiss exchanged between strangers who were trying to be polite about an uncomfortable situation. The congregation erupted in applause that was perhaps a bit too enthusiastic, as if everyone was relieved that the ceremony had proceeded without incident. Mrs. Patterson immediately took charge of directing people toward the church hall, where the Ladies' Aid Society had laid out their modest wedding feast. The reception was a study in careful conversation and meaningful glances. People congratulated the couple with the kind of hearty well-wishes usually reserved for those facing uncertain medical procedures. The food was excellent. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans preserved from last summer's garden, and 3 different types of pie. Someone had even managed to procure a small wedding cake, though it leaned slightly to one side and the frosting roses had seen better days. Bo navigated the social requirements with the same grim efficiency he brought to everything else these days. He accepted congratulations, made appropriate responses to questions about their plans, and managed to look grateful for advice he clearly didn't want. Willa found herself watching him with new interest, noting the way he positioned his chair to accommodate conversation, how he managed to make his limited mobility seem deliberate rather than restrictive. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally made their way to the cabin that would now be home. Bo had driven them in a modified buckboard, the reins adapted for his use, while Willa sat beside him trying not to wince every time the wheels hit a rut. The baby had been restless all day, perhaps sensing the tension and change, and by the time they reached the cabin, Willa was fighting waves of discomfort that had nothing to do with the rough ride. The cabin looked different somehow, transformed by the Ladies' Aid Society into something that resembled a proper home. Curtains hung at the windows, rugs covered the plank floors, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen. Someone had even placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, a touch of femininity that made the masculine space feel more welcoming. "They mean well," Bo said, maneuvering his chair through the doorway with practiced ease. His voice held the tone of a man who'd learned to accept help gracefully, even when he'd rather handle things himself. "It's lovely," Willa replied, though she was thinking more about the practical aspects of the arrangement. The main room contained a fireplace, table, chairs, and a bed that had obviously been pushed against the far wall to make room for Bo's chair. The second room, smaller and currently serving as storage, would presumably become the nursery. The evening stretched ahead of them with the peculiar awkwardness of strangers who'd just committed to spending their lives together. They ate the cold supper the ladies had left, making careful conversation about practical matters, the condition of the well, the state of the garden, plans for winter preparations. It was the kind of talk that filled silence without requiring intimacy, the verbal equivalent of walking on tiptoe. Willa excused herself to change out of her wedding dress, grateful for a few moments alone to process the enormity of what she'd just done. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a dresser that had been cleared to accommodate her few belongings. Someone had placed a nightgown on the bed, new white cotton with tiny buttons, obviously a wedding gift from the Ladies' Aid Society. When she emerged, she found Bo sitting by the fireplace, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows across his weathered face. He'd removed his vest and rolled up his sleeves, and for the first time that day, he looked less like a man performing a duty and more like someone trying to figure out how to live with the choices he'd made. "The bed's yours," he said without looking at her. "I'll take the settee for now, until we figure things out." Willa felt something unclench in her chest, relief, perhaps, or gratitude for his consideration. "Thank you. There's no need to thank me for common decency." She settled into the rocking chair that Widow Larson had donated, her hands automatically moving to cradle her belly. The baby was active tonight, responding to the day's stress with restless movement that made sleep seem unlikely. "When's the child due?" Bo asked, still watching the fire. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Dr. Whitley says it's hard to tell exactly. "And you're managing all right? With the pregnancy, I mean." It was the first personal question he'd asked. Her and Willa considered how to answer honestly without sounding like she was complaining. "Some days are harder than others. The baby's strong, though. Takes after its father that way." Bo nodded, a gesture that seemed to encompass sympathy, understanding, and perhaps a hint of his own grief for dreams that would never be realized. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, two people beginning to learn each other's rhythms. That's when the pain struck. Sudden, sharp, radiating from her lower back around to her belly with an intensity that made her gasp and double over. The rocking chair creaked as she gripped its arms, her knuckles white with strain. "Willa?" Beau's voice cut through the haze of discomfort. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she managed between gasps. "Something's different." Beau was moving before. She finished speaking, wheeling his chair across the room with swift efficiency. His hands, steady and sure despite everything else, reached for her wrists, checking her pulse, his touch professional and reassuring. How long since the last pain like this? There haven't been any. Not like this. Another wave hit, stronger than the first, and Willa couldn't suppress a cry. Beau's jaw tightened, and she saw him make a decision that would define their marriage from its very first night. "I'm getting Dr. Whitley," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Can you manage until I get back?" "Beau, you can't," she started. To protest, thinking of the dark road, the distance to town, his limitations. "Watch me," he said, and wheeled himself toward the door with the determination of a man who just remembered what it meant to have something worth fighting for. As the door closed behind him and she heard the sound of his modified buckboard. Pulling away into the night, Willa realized that their marriage had already moved beyond the careful politeness they'd planned. Crisis, it seemed, had a way of cutting through pretense and revealing what people were really made of. The pain came again, and she gripped the arms of the rocking chair, waiting for her husband to return. Dr. Whitley arrived within the hour, his medical bag bouncing against his hip as he followed Beau through the cabin door. The older man's face was flushed from the ride, but his hands were steady as he examined Willa, asking questions in the calm, methodical way that had earned him the trust of every family within 50 miles. "False labor," he pronounced after what felt like an eternity of prodding and listening. "Common enough with first babies, especially after a day of stress and excitement. The child's not ready yet, but your body's practicing for the real event." Willa sagged against the pillows someone had propped behind her, relief making her limbs feel heavy. "So the baby's all right. Strong heartbeat. Good position. You just need rest, and I mean real rest. No heavy lifting, no long days on your feet. Your husband here will need to take over the household duties for a while." Beau, who had been silent since the doctor's arrival, cleared his throat. "I can manage that." Dr. Whitley studied him with the frank assessment of a man who'd known Beau since he was a wild-haired boy riding calves at church socials. "I expect you can. Might even do you some good, having someone to take care of again." After the doctor left with promises to check on Willa in a few days, an awkward domesticity settled over the cabin. Beau proved surprisingly adept at managing household tasks from his chair. He'd adapted his techniques over the months since his accident, learning to cook on a stove lowered to accommodate his reach, to clean using long-handled tools he'd fashioned himself, to maintain a home that functioned around his limitations rather than despite them. Willa watched from the bed where she'd been confined, noting the careful precision with which he moved, the way he'd organized everything within easy reach. There was something almost meditative about his approach to daily tasks, as if the rhythm of domestic work provided a structure that other parts of his life had lost. "You don't have to stay in bed all day," he said on the second morning, bringing her breakfast on a tray he'd balanced across his lap. Doc said rest, not complete inactivity. Fresh air might do you good. The tray held scrambled eggs, bacon fried to perfection, and biscuits that rivaled anything the Ladies' Aid Society had ever produced. Willa looked up at him in surprise. "You made these biscuits?" "My mother's recipe. She insisted all her boys learn to cook, said depending on a woman for your meals was a sure way to starve if something happened to her." It was the first personal information he'd shared about his family, and Willa filed it away like a small treasure. "How many brothers did you have?" "3, all older. All scattered to the winds now. One went to California during the gold rush, one's farming in Oregon, and the youngest died of fever when he was 22. Beau's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned to speak of loss without drowning in it. I'm sorry. Long time ago. Death's part of life out here. You learn to carry it without letting it crush you. Over the following days, a routine developed between them. Beau would wake before dawn, tend to the animals he kept, 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and a horse he could no longer ride but couldn't bring himself to sell. He'd return to prepare breakfast, his movements efficient and practiced, then spend the morning on farm tasks, adapted to his capabilities. Willa discovered that confinement gave her a unique perspective on her new husband. She watched him work. In the garden, pulling weeds from his chair with tools he'd modified to extend his reach. She saw him repair a broken fence rail using a pulley system he'd rigged to lift heavy materials. Most surprising of all, she observed him carving something from a piece of maple, his hands moving with the same fluid grace they'd once shown with rope and reins. "What are you making?" she asked one afternoon, when curiosity finally overcame. Politeness. Beau held up the partially completed object, a wooden spoon with an unusually long handle. "Kitchen tools," he said simply. "Some things are easier to reach if the handles are longer." The spoon was beautiful work, the wood sanded smooth as silk, the handle carved with a subtle pattern that spoke of hours of patient labor. It was practical, art beauty born from necessity, and Willa found herself moved by the care he'd put into something so simple. "You're quite skilled with your hands." "Had to learn. Can't reach everything from down here, so you either adapt or do without." As the days passed, Willa began to see the extent of Beau's adaptations. The cabin had been subtly modified to accommodate his needs. Counters lowered, shelves repositioned, pathways widened to allow his chair to move freely. He'd created a workshop in the barn where he could pursue woodworking and minor repairs. The workbench designed at the perfect height for someone seated. More impressive still was his innovation in farming techniques. He'd developed a system of raised beds that allowed him to tend vegetables without leaving his chair. His irrigation method used gravity and carefully positioned channels to water crops with minimal physical effort. He'd even modified a plow to be operated from a seated position, though he hadn't had occasion to use it yet. "You've built quite a life here," Willa observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. "Wasn't much choice. Could either figure out how to live with what I had left, or waste away feeling sorry for myself. Some people would have chosen the latter." Beau was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "Some days I still do," he admitted, "but those days come less often now." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Since their wedding, Beau had been unfailingly courteous, but emotionally distant, as if he were determined to be a proper husband without allowing her too close to whatever pain he carried. This glimpse of vulnerability felt like a gift, carefully given. "Do you miss it? Riding, I mean." "Every day," the answer came without hesitation. "Not just the riding itself, but the freedom, I suppose. The feeling that you could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you wanted to be. Now I'm whoever this chair lets me be." Willa shifted in her own chair, feeling the baby move restlessly against her ribs. "Maybe we're all limited by something. You have your chair, I have this pregnancy. Other people have fear or lack of money or a dozen other things that hold them back. Doesn't make it easier." "No," she agreed, "but it makes it less lonely, knowing you're not the only one figuring out how to live with limitations." That night, as Willa settled into bed and Beau arranged his blankets on the settee, she felt something shift between them. Not love, that would take time if it came at all, but understanding. They were both people who'd had to rebuild their lives around circumstances they hadn't chosen, and perhaps that shared experience could be the foundation for something stronger than mere convenience. The baby kicked against her ribs as if in agreement, and Willa placed her hand on her belly, wondering what kind of world she was bringing her child into. Whatever challenges lay ahead, At least the child would have a father who understood that strength wasn't measured by what a person could do, but by how they responded when those abilities were taken away. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, carrying with it the promise of change and the challenge of endurance. Inside the cabin, two people who'd started as strangers began the slow, careful work of learning to be partners in whatever came next. The first hard frost came early that year, coating the prairie grass with crystals that turned the world into something from a fairy tale. Will awoke to find Bo already up, stoking the fire to chase away the chill that had crept through the cabin's walls during the night. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he sat, she corrected herself, at the window, watching the sun burn away the frost with methodical precision. "Winter's coming fast," he said without turning around. "We'll need to start bringing in the last of the garden soon." Willa eased herself out of bed, her movements careful and deliberate. At 8 months pregnant, everything required planning: how to stand, how to walk, how to bend without losing her balance. The baby had grown considerably since their wedding 6 weeks ago, and Dr. Whitley assured her this was a good sign, though it made even simple tasks increasingly challenging. "I can help with the harvesting," she offered, though they both knew her contribution would be limited. "You can supervise from a chair," Bo replied, finally turning to look at her. His expression had grown warmer over the weeks, less guarded, though he still maintained the careful courtesy of a man who wasn't entirely sure where he stood. Direct operations from a position of authority. There was humor in his voice now, something that had emerged gradually as they'd learned each other's routines. Willa had discovered that Bo possessed a dry wit that he deployed sparingly, like a spice used to season otherwise serious conversation. The harvesting took 3 days, with Bo moving methodically through the garden while Willa sorted vegetables from her perch on the porch. The work gave them a rhythm that felt almost natural. He would bring baskets of potatoes, turnips, and carrots to her, and she would clean and sort them for storage. The baby blanket she was knitting for their soon-to-arrive child lay across her lap, growing longer with each completed row. The blanket had become a project that consumed her evenings, the repetitive motion of the needles providing a meditative counterpoint to the day's activities. She'd chosen yarn in soft blues and greens, colors that would suit either a boy or girl, and worked a simple pattern that her mother had taught her years ago. The wool had come from their own sheep, 3 ewes that Bo had acquired before his accident and managed to keep despite his changed circumstances. "You're getting quite good at that," Bo observed one evening, watching her fingers work the intricate cable pattern she'd decided to attempt along the border. "My mother was an excellent knitter. She tried to teach me when I was young, but I was too impatient then. Funny how circumstances change your priorities. Looks like you inherited her skill, even if it took time to develop." The compliment pleased her more than it should have. Over the weeks, she'd come to value Bo's opinion, perhaps because he didn't offer praise lightly. When he said something was well done, he meant it. Their domestic partnership had evolved into something surprisingly comfortable. Bo had taken over most of the cooking, partly from necessity, but also, Willa suspected, because he enjoyed it. His meals were simple but well prepared, seasoned with herbs he grew in the kitchen garden, and served with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine care rather than mere obligation. In return, Willa had assumed responsibility for mending laundry and the lighter household tasks she could manage from a chair. She'd also taken over the cabin's financial records, discovering that Bo had a tendency to be overly generous with credit to neighbors who were struggling and correspondingly poor at collecting what was owed to him. "Jorgensen hasn't paid for the harness repair you did 3 months ago," she mentioned one evening, reviewing the ledger book Bo had reluctantly allowed her to examine. "He's had a hard year, lost 2 horses to colic, and his oldest boy broke his leg and couldn't help with the harvest. That's very sympathetic, but sympathy doesn't pay for winter supplies." Bo looked uncomfortable with the conversation, the way men often did when practical matters of money intruded on their sense of honor. I can't ask a man to pay when he's struggling to feed his family. You're not asking him to pay. You're asking him to honor his debt. There's a difference. The discussion had led to their first real disagreement, a careful, polite argument about the balance between charity and survival that revealed fundamental differences in how they approached the world. Beau's impulse was to help others, even when it cost him dearly. Willa's experience had taught her that good intentions meant little when you couldn't afford food for your own table. They'd reached a compromise of sorts. Beau would continue his generous instincts, but Willa would track the accounts and ensure they didn't extend more credit than they could afford to lose. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt like progress toward becoming true partners rather than polite strangers sharing the same roof. The compromise had been tested when Sarah Brennan arrived at their door on a cold October morning. Her 3 young children in tow and desperation written across her wind-burned face. Her husband had been injured in a threshing accident, and they faced the prospect of winter without adequate supplies or income. Beau's immediate response was to invite them in, offer food, and begin calculating how much he could spare from their own stores. Willa watched him make mental inventories, saw him preparing to give away resources they couldn't easily replace, and felt the familiar tension between compassion and practicality. "We can help," she said before Beau could make commitments they might regret, "but let's be smart about it." What followed was an hour of careful negotiation that satisfied everyone involved. The Brennan family received immediate aid, food, warm clothes, and a loan that would see them through winter. In return, Sarah would help with household tasks that were becoming difficult for Willa to manage, and her oldest boy, 12-year-old Michael, would assist Beau with farm work that required 2 sets of hands. "You're quite the diplomat," Beau said, after the family had left, with their arms full of supplies and their faces bright with relief. "I'm practical. There's a difference between helping people and letting them become dependent. This way, everyone maintains their dignity." Beau nodded slowly, and Willa could see him processing the lesson. It was another small step in their ongoing education about each other, another piece of evidence that their hasty marriage might have more solid foundations than either had dared to hope. As November arrived with its promise of shorter days and longer nights, Willa found herself genuinely looking forward to the baby's arrival, not just because she was tired of being pregnant, though that was certainly true, but because she wanted to see how Beau would respond to becoming a father. She'd watched him with the Brennan children, noted his patience and gentle humor, and thought that perhaps the child growing beneath her heart would be lucky in ways she was only beginning to understand. The blanket was nearly finished now, its soft folds ready to welcome a new life into a home that had become something neither of its adult inhabitants had expected. A place where 2 people who'd started as strangers were slowly, carefully, learning to become family. The baby arrived on a bitter December morning when the wind howled like a living thing around the cabin's eaves. Willa's labor began before dawn, waking her with pains that felt different from the false alarms she'd experienced weeks earlier. These contractions came with a purpose that her body recognized even before her mind fully understood what was happening. Beau woke to find her gripping the edge of the bed, her face pale in the lamplight he'd quickly lit. His training in emergency situations, learned during years of dealing with injured horses and cowboys, served him well now. He moved with calm efficiency, sending young Michael Brennan racing through the pre-dawn darkness to fetch Dr. Whitley while he prepared the cabin for what was to come. Sarah Brennan arrived first, her experienced hands and steady presence proving invaluable as Willa's labor intensified. Dr. Whitley followed an hour later, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, the latter being standard equipment for frontier births, useful for both sterilization and fortification. "Everything looks normal," the doctor pronounced after his examination. "Strong, healthy baby, good position. This shouldn't take too long for a first child." But labor, like prairie weather, followed its own schedule. The hours stretched into afternoon, then toward evening, with Willa moving between the bed and the rocking chair, seeking positions that would ease the increasing intensity of her contractions. Bo stayed close, offering water when she could drink it, a steady hand when she needed support, and the kind of quiet presence that spoke louder than words. Emma Rose McKenna entered the world just as the sun was setting, her first cry strong, enough to rattle the windows. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head full of dark hair, and lungs that announced her displeasure with the cold world she'd been thrust into. "She's beautiful," Bo whispered, his voice rough with emotion, as Dr. Whitley placed the cleaned and wrapped baby in his arms. The sight of the burly ex-cowboy cradling the tiny infant with infinite gentleness brought tears to Sarah Brennan's eyes and made Willa's heart clench with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The first weeks of Emma's life established rhythms that none of them had anticipated. Bo proved to be a natural father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint, changing diapers with the same methodical precision he brought to every task, and spending hours simply watching the baby sleep with an expression of wonder that transformed his weathered features. "You'd think she was the first baby ever born," Willa observed one morning, finding Bo at the kitchen table with Emma nestled in the crook of his arm while he attempted to eat breakfast one-handed. "Maybe she is," he replied seriously. "The first one that was ever mine to protect, anyway." The word mine carried weight that Willa was still learning to interpret. Bo had embraced fatherhood with an intensity that suggested he'd found something he'd been searching for without realizing it. Emma wasn't his biological child, but biology seemed irrelevant to the bond that had formed between them almost instantly. Winter deepened around their small family, bringing challenges that tested their resilience in new ways. The modified saddle that Bo had been secretly working on in the barn became a necessity rather than a mere project, when their horse, Ranger, developed a limp that required daily attention. The saddle, redesigned to accommodate Bo's paralyzed legs while still allowing him to ride, represented months of careful engineering and stubborn determination. Willa discovered the extent of Bo's innovation when she found him in the barn one morning, mounted on Ranger for the first time since his accident. The saddle was a marvel of adapted design, broader than traditional models, with supports that held his legs in position and straps that secured him safely in place. Most impressive was the freedom it gave him to use his upper body strength to control the horse through reins and subtle weight shifts. "You're riding again," she said, not quite believing what she was seeing. After a fashion, Bo's voice carried a mixture of pride and caution. "It's not the same as it was, but it gets me where I need to go." The ability to ride, even in this modified way, opened new possibilities for their small farm. Bo could now check on cattle in distant pastures, travel to neighboring farms more easily, and restore some of the mobility that his accident had taken away. More importantly, Willa could see what the achievement meant to him, not just practically, but emotionally. He sat straighter in the saddle, carried himself with more confidence, spoke with less of the careful reserve that had characterized their early marriage. But mobility brought its own complications. A visit to the bank in town to discuss extending their mortgage revealed problems that Bo had been reluctant to share. The farm was mortgaged to its full value. Payments were behind due to poor crop yields and unpaid debts from neighbors, and the banker's patience was wearing thin. "We need to discuss your situation, McKenna," Harold Fitzpatrick had said, his tone carrying the kind of finality that made strong men nervous. "The bank can't carry accounts indefinitely, especially when there's no clear path to repayment." The ride home had been conducted in the kind of silence that spoke louder than arguments. Bo's jaw was set in lines that Willa recognized as his way of processing difficult information, while she held Emma close and tried to calculate solutions to problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. "How bad is it?" she asked once they were home, and Emma, was settled for her nap. Bo rubbed his face with hands that suddenly looked older than his 35 years. Bad enough. We've got until spring to catch up on payments or they'll foreclose. 3 months to find money we don't have for debts we can't avoid. What about the people who owe you money? Jorgensen, the Brennans, the others. Most of them are in the same situation we are. Asking them to pay debts they can't afford won't solve our problems. Just create new ones for them. Willa looked around. The cabin that had become home, thinking of all the modifications Bo had made, all the work they'd put into creating a life together. The thought of losing it felt like a physical blow, but she'd learned during her first marriage that panic was less useful than planning. Then we find another way, she said simply. We're not the first people to face financial troubles, and we won't be the last. There has to be something we can do. Bo looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with surprise, as if he'd expected her to blame him for their circumstances, rather than accept them as a shared challenge. What do you suggest? Willa settled into the rocking chair, her mind already working through possibilities. The cabin was warm, Emma was healthy, and they had each other. Surely that was foundation enough to build whatever solution they needed. Start by making a list of everything we have, everything we can do, and everyone who might help. Then we figure out how to turn resources into income. As Bo pulled out paper and pencil to begin their inventory, Willa allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow with no options. Now she was a wife and mother, facing challenges with a partner who'd proven himself worthy of trust. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the Dakota wind sang its ancient song of endurance and change. Inside, 2 people who'd married as strangers prepared to fight for the future they were still learning to share. The solution came from an unexpected source: Widow Larson's arthritis. The elderly woman appeared at their door on a February morning, when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the cold made breathing feel like swallowing knives. She moved carefully up the path Bo had cleared, her gnarled hands clutching a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "I need help," she announced without preamble, settling herself in the chair Bo hastily vacated. "These old hands can't manage fine work anymore, and I've got orders to fill." The bundle contained leather work, half-finished gloves, bridles awaiting repair, and a commissioned saddle that represented months of income for someone willing to complete the intricate tooling. Widow Larson had built a reputation over 30 years for producing some of the finest leather goods in the territory. But her hands could no longer manage the detailed work that set her products apart. "I can pay 20% of the final sale. In price for completion work," she offered, her sharp eyes fixed on Bo's face, "assuming the quality meets my standards." Bo examined the pieces with the eye of someone who understood both leatherwork and the desperation behind the offer. His own hands, strengthened by months of wheelchair use and farm work, were steady and precise. More importantly, he possessed the patience that fine leatherwork required. 30%, Willa interjected before Bo could accept the original terms. "And we provide our own tools and workspace." The negotiation that followed established the foundation for what would become their salvation. Bo would complete Widow Larson's existing orders and take on new commissions under her established reputation. Willa would handle the business aspects, pricing, customer relations, and the careful bookkeeping that ensured profit rather than mere survival. The work proved to be exactly what Bo needed. His hands, idle for too long, remembered the skills. His father had taught him before. The allure of rodeo life had pulled him away from the family trade. The leather responded to his touch like a familiar friend, and the rhythmic motion of tooling patterns provided a meditation that helped quiet the restless energy that still plagued him during long winter evenings. "You're quite good at this," Willa observed one evening, watching him work on a particularly intricate floral pattern for a lady's riding gloves. Emma slept in her cradleboard nearby, the baby's presence providing a peaceful backdrop to the cabin's industrious atmosphere. My father was a master leather worker. He tried to teach me the trade, but I was too eager to see what was over the next hill. Beau's hands never paused in their steady rhythm. Funny how you sometimes have to lose everything to appreciate what was right in front of you all along. The leather work began bringing in steady income, just as their financial situation reached its most critical point. The gloves Beau had crafted with such care sold for prices that surprised even Widow Larson, and word of his skill spread through the network of ranchers and townspeople who valued quality craftsmanship over mass-produced goods. By March, they had caught up on their mortgage payments and established enough of a cushion to breathe freely for the first time since their marriage. More importantly, the work had given Beau a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was creating things of beauty and utility, building a reputation based on skill rather than pity, and contributing to their household in ways that had nothing to do with his physical limitations. The success of the leather business attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A traveling merchant offered to carry Beau's work to markets in larger towns, promising exposure to customers who could afford premium prices for exceptional quality. A saddlery in Denver inquired about exclusive arrangements for custom work. Most surprising of all, a Wild West show promoter approached them about creating exhibition pieces for performers who valued both function and showmanship. "We could expand," Willa suggested one evening as they reviewed their growing list of orders. "Hire help, increase production, maybe even open a proper shop in town." Beau considered the suggestion while carefully beveling the edge of a gun holster destined for a sheriff in Cheyenne. "Expansion means debt, risk, pressure to produce quantity over quality. I'm not sure that's what I want." "What do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business decisions. Beau set down his tools and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. What he saw was a woman who had grown, from desperate widow to confident partner, someone who had embraced the challenges of frontier life and made herself indispensable not through dependence, but through competence. "I want what we have," he said finally. "This cabin, this work, this life we've built together. I want Emma to grow up knowing that her father creates beautiful things with his hands, not that he owns a business that creates products for profit." The admission revealed something that Willa had suspected but never voiced. Beau's accident had changed more than his ability to walk. It had fundamentally altered his relationship with ambition, success, and the measurement of a man's worth. The boy who had left home seeking adventure and acclaim had been replaced by a man who valued stability, craftsmanship, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. "Then we stay small," she agreed. "We take the orders we want, charge what our work is worth, and build something that will last." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's cry from her cradleboard. Beau wheeled over to pick her up, his movements practiced and confident. As he settled the baby against his shoulder, Willa felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Somewhere during the long winter months, while they struggled with debts and learned to work together, while Beau rediscovered his hands' capability and she found her own strength, they had become something neither had expected when they spoke their vows in Mrs. Patterson's charitable arrangement. They had become a family. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of weather that made even confirmed pessimists believe in second chances. The snow melted quickly, revealing ground that was rich and ready for planting. Beau's leatherwork had established their financial security, but the farm still called to him with the promise of new beginnings. "I want to try something different this year," he announced one morning as they planned the garden layout. "Vegetables are fine, but I'm thinking about crops that might bring better prices. Maybe some of that new wheat variety Henderson's been talking about." Willa looked up from the seed catalogues spread across the kitchen table, noting the excitement in Beau's voice. It was the same tone he'd used when describing his plans for the leather business, the sound of a man who had found something worth working toward. What did you have in mind? As Bo outlined his vision for diversifying their farm operations, Willa found herself nodding in agreement. They had learned to trust each other's judgment, to combine her practical caution with his innovative spirit. Whatever they decided to plant, whatever risks they chose to take, they would face the results together. Outside, the Dakota prairies stretched endlessly under a sky that promised warmth and growth. Inside the cabin, two people who had started as strangers planned for a future that belonged to both of them. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday in late April, carried by a dusty stranger who claimed to be passing through but whose eyes held the careful alertness of a man with specific business to conduct. He found Bo working in the barn, leather tools spread across his modified workbench, and handed over an envelope with the kind of formal politeness that immediately put both husband and wife on guard. "From Dr. Marcus Henley in Denver," the man said simply. "He asked me to make sure it reached you personally." After the stranger left, Bo stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside, along with a brief letter, was a photograph that made his hands shake as he held it. The image showed him in his glory days, mounted on a magnificent bay stallion, arms raised in victory after a successful ride, his face bright with the kind of joy that comes from doing exactly what you were born to do. But it wasn't the photograph that stunned him into silence. It was what Dr. Henley had written on the back in careful script. Patient exhibited full sensation and movement in lower extremities following experimental treatment. Recovery documented June 1891, 3 months post-injury. Why did you disappear? Willa found him an hour later, still sitting motionless in his chair, the letter and photograph clutched in his hands. When she read the contents, her own face went pale with the implications of what Dr. Henley was suggesting. "I don't understand," she said, settling into a nearby chair with Emma in her arms. "What does this mean?" Bo's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of a confession that had been buried for almost 2 years. "Dr. Henley was the specialist they brought in after my accident. He tried a new procedure, something involving electrical stimulation and surgery to reduce swelling on my spine. For a few weeks, I was getting feeling back in my legs, some movement. Everyone said it was a miracle. And then I ran." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting someone else's story. "I couldn't handle the hope, the expectations, the possibility that I might get everything back, only to lose it again. So I left Denver, came here, told everyone, including myself, that I was permanently paralyzed." Willa stared at him, trying to process the enormity of what he was telling her. "You chose this? You chose the wheelchair, chose to let everyone believe you were helpless, chose to let me marry you, thinking you were disabled?" "I was terrified," Bo said simply. "Terrified of hope, terrified of disappointment, terrified of being the man I used to be." That man was reckless, selfish, cared more about his own glory than about anything or anyone else. This man, he gestured to himself, this man learned to value different things. The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, altering everything Willa thought she knew about their marriage, their life together, the choices they had both made. Emma began to fuss, sensing the tension in the room, and Willa automatically rocked her while her mind raced through implications. "Can you walk?" she asked finally. "I don't know. It's been 2 years since I've tried. The sensation comes and goes. Always has. Some days I can feel my legs, some days I can't. I've been too afraid to find out if the movement came back too." Willa set Emma in her cradleboard and moved to kneel in front of Bo's chair. Her hands, steady despite her emotional turmoil, reached for his legs through the blanket that perpetually covered them. "Can you feel this?" Bo's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "Yes." "And this?" She pressed against his thigh, watching his face for reactions. "Yes." "Then try," she said simply, "try to move them. What followed was perhaps the most excruciating 10 minutes of both their lives. Beau's face contorted with effort and fear as he attempted movements he'd convinced himself were impossible. At first, nothing happened. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, his right foot began to twitch inside his boot. "My God," Willa whispered. "Beau, look." The movement was minimal, a flexing of his ankle, a slight bend at the knee, but it was undeniably there. Beau stared at his legs as if they belonged to a stranger, his face cycling through disbelief, joy, and terror in rapid succession. "I can feel them," he said, his voice breaking. "I can actually feel them." But the miracle of potential recovery was overshadowed by a more immediate concern. If Beau's paralysis had been partly self-imposed, if he had chosen to abandon treatment that might have restored his mobility, then what did that say about everything else? About their marriage, their partnership, the life they had built together? Based on what she now realized were false premises. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Beau reached into his pocket and withdrew a second letter, this one bearing the official seal of the territorial government. "Because Henderson brought this by yesterday while you were visiting the Brennans. There's going to be a territorial inquiry into flood preparedness. They want me to serve as emergency coordinator for our district." Willa read the letter with growing understanding. The territory was establishing a network of emergency coordinators, people with the skills and knowledge to organize community responses to natural disasters. Beau's reputation for innovation and leadership, built during their months of marriage, had reached official attention, but accepting such a position would require mobility, authority, and the kind of physical presence that his wheelchair had seemed to preclude. "They don't know about your condition. They know I'm disabled, but they also know what I've accomplished despite it. The problem is, the job would require travel, inspections of remote areas, coordination with people who might not respect a man in a chair." The implications crystallized with devastating clarity. Beau could potentially walk again, could reclaim the mobility that had defined his identity before the accident, could step into a role that would give him influence and respect throughout the territory. But doing so would mean admitting that he had deceived everyone, including her, about the true nature of his limitations. "What do you want to do?" Willa asked, though her heart was already breaking with the certainty of his answer. Beau looked around the cabin they had made into a home, at the baby who had never known him as anything other than the man in the wheelchair, at the wife who had married him, believing she was saving a broken cowboy rather than building a life with someone who had chosen brokenness over the risk of hope. "I want to try to walk again," he said quietly, "but I'm terrified of what that might cost us." Emma began to cry, her infant distress cutting through the charged atmosphere of the cabin. As Willa moved to comfort their daughter, she realized that their marriage had just reached a crossroads that would determine not only who Beau would become, but what kind of future they could build together. The photograph lay on the table between them, evidence of a man Beau used to be, might still be, or might choose to become again. Outside, the spring winds carried promises of change that neither of them was sure they were ready to embrace. The rains began 3 days after Beau's revelation, arriving with the kind of gentle persistence that the prairie welcomed after a long winter. For the first week, they were a blessing, soaking into the newly planted fields, filling the water barrels, and washing the dust from the air with a cleanliness that made everyone step outside just to breathe deeply. By the second week, the blessing had become a concern. The gentle showers had given way to steady downpours that turned the rich prairie soil into a muddy morass and made even simple tasks like feeding the animals an ordeal of slipping and sliding through muck that seemed determined to claim anything that ventured onto its surface. During the third week, concern became alarm. The creek that meandered peacefully past their property had swollen to twice its normal size, its banks beginning to overflow into the lower pastures where their few cattle huddled on whatever high ground they could find. The road to town had become impassable except on horseback, and even that required careful navigation around washouts and newly formed channels that appeared overnight. Throughout it all, Bo continued his secret attempts to regain the use of his legs. Each morning, before Will awoke, he would transfer himself to the bed and spend an hour working through exercises he barely remembered from his time with Dr. Henley in Denver. The progress was maddeningly slow. Some days he could stand for a few minutes with the aid of a walker he'd fashioned from barnwood. Other days his legs refused to support him at all. Willa watched his struggles with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. She wanted him to succeed, wanted to see him reclaim the mobility that the accident had stolen. But she also feared what his recovery might mean for them, for the partnership they had built on the foundation of his limitations. The man who might walk again was not the same man who had learned to find contentment in a wheelchair, and she wasn't sure which version of Bo she was married to. Their conversations during this period were careful, circling around the enormous questions that neither felt ready to address directly. What would happen if he could walk? Would he accept the territorial position? Would he still want the quiet life they had built together, or would the old restlessness return with his recovered mobility? The emergency bell arrived on a Tuesday, carried by 3 men who rode through the steady rain with the kind of grim determination that spoke of urgent business. It was a massive bronze bell, cast in Chicago and shipped west at territorial expense, designed to sound warnings that could be heard for miles across the open prairie. Emergency coordinator equipment, the lead rider explained as they wrestled the bell from their pack wagon. Territorial orders. You're to mount it in a location where it can be heard throughout the district. Bo accepted the assignment with the quiet competence that had become his trademark, though Willa noticed the tension in his shoulders as he examined the mounting instructions. The bell tower would need to be 30 feet high to achieve maximum sound coverage, and operating it during an emergency would require someone capable of climbing that height repeatedly. "I can manage it," he said when Willa voiced her concerns. "The pulley system I designed for the barn lifting can be adapted. I don't need to climb the tower if I can operate the bell from ground level." But even as he spoke, they both knew the limitation such an arrangement would impose. During a real emergency, when seconds might mean the difference between life and death, the territorial coordinator would need to be mobile, decisive, and physically capable of doing whatever the crisis demanded. The bell tower construction became a community effort that revealed how much their standing in Clearwater had changed over the past year. Neighbors who had once regarded Bo with pity now arrived with tools and labor, deferring to his engineering expertise and following his directions without question. The man in the wheelchair had become someone they trusted with their safety, and that trust carried a weight of responsibility that Bo felt with increasing intensity. "People are depending on you," Reverend Morrison observed one evening as he helped position the bell's mounting hardware. "The territory wouldn't have appointed you if they didn't believe you could handle whatever comes." "What if I can't?" Bo asked, voicing the fear that had haunted him since accepting the position. "What if when the crisis comes, I'm not enough?" The Reverend paused in his work, studying Bo with the careful attention he usually reserved for his most troubled parishioners. "Son, I've watched you build a life out of circumstances that would have broken lesser men. I've seen you adapt, innovate, and overcome challenges that would have sent most people running. If you're not enough, then God help us all, because you're the best we've got." The conversation was interrupted by young Michael Brennan, who came splashing through the mud with news that turned everyone's attention from philosophy to immediate practicality. The creek was rising faster than anyone had seen before, threatening to overflow its banks within hours rather than days. "My pa says it's the worst flooding he's seen in 20 years, Michael reported, his young face serious with the importance of his message. "He sent me to tell you that the Peterson place is already underwater and the Jorgensens are moving their animals to higher ground." Bo felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded his most challenging rides. the heightened awareness that came when everything depended on split-second decisions and flawless execution. But now, instead of preparing to mount a bucking bronco, he was calculating evacuation routes, estimating how much time they had before the crisis became catastrophic, and accepting that people's lives might depend on choices he made in the next few hours. "Ring the bell," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present, including himself. 3 long peals, then 3 short ones, then 3 long again. "That's the signal for General Assembly," as the bronze bell's voice rolled across the prairie, calling the scattered families of their district to gather at the McKenna farm. Bo felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. This was what he had been appointed to do, what the territory expected of him, what his neighbors needed from him. But it was also the moment when his physical limitations would be tested against the demands of real crisis management. The bell tower stood 30 feet above them, accessible only by ladder. The evacuation routes he needed to survey stretched across miles of rough terrain. The coordination required might demand mobility that his wheelchair couldn't provide. Willa appeared at his side, Emma wrapped in blankets against the rain, her face reflecting the same mixture of pride and fear that he felt. "What do you need?" From me, the question carried implications far beyond the immediate crisis. She was asking what role she would play in whatever came next, whether she would be partner or dependent, helper or hindrance in the challenges ahead. "Everything," he answered honestly. "I'm going to need everything you can give." As families began arriving in response to the bell's summons, their faces grim with the knowledge that the rising water represented a threat unlike anything they had faced before. Bo realized that the next few hours would determine more than just their communities' survival. They would reveal whether the man he had become was strong enough to handle the responsibilities he had accepted, whether his marriage could survive the pressure of crisis and change, and whether the life they had built together was solid enough to weather whatever flood was coming. The rain continued to fall, and the creek continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the prairie like a warning that the real test was just beginning. The families gathered in the McKenna barn as the rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity. Bo positioned himself at the center of the group, his wheelchair creating a natural focal point as neighbors who had once whispered about the charitable arrangement now looked to him for guidance that might save their lives. "The water's rising. Faster than any of us expected," he began, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the storm. "We need to move people and livestock to high ground before the creek overflows completely." Old Jorgensen raised a weathered hand. "How much time do we have?" Bo had been calculating the answer since Michael Brennan's arrival, factoring in the rate of rainfall, the creek's capacity, and the elevation of the most vulnerable properties. 6 hours, maybe 8 if the rain slows, but we can't count on that. The evacuation plan that emerged from their discussion was complex but necessary. The highest ground in their district was a ridge 2 miles north of the creek, accessible by a wagon road that was still passable despite the mud. Families with young children would go first, followed by the elderly and those with the most livestock to move. "What about supplies?" Sarah Brennan asked, her practical mind already working through the logistics of sheltering dozens of people. "For an unknown period. Take what you can carry, prioritize necessities," Bo replied. "Food, blankets, medicine, tools, everything else can be replaced." As the group began to disperse to their preparations, Dr. Whitley approached Bo with the kind of grave expression that preceded difficult conversations. "I need to ask something that might not have an easy answer," he said quietly. "If someone gets trapped, if we need to reach people the wagons can't get to, how do we handle rescue operations?" The question struck at the heart of Bo's deepest fears about accepting the coordinator position. In a true emergency, lives might depend on someone's ability to move quickly across dangerous terrain, to wade through floodwaters, to reach places that were inaccessible to a man in a wheelchair. "We improvise," Bo said finally. "We use ropes. Boats if necessary, teams of people working together. We find a way." But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in the doctor's eyes, the unspoken worry that good intentions might not be enough when seconds counted, and physical capability was the difference between rescue and tragedy. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. As the evacuation began in earnest, a messenger arrived with news that changed everything. The Hendersons, elderly couple who lived closest to the creek, had refused to leave their home and were now cut off by rising water that had already claimed their barn and was lapping at their front porch. "We need to get them out," Dr. Whitley said urgently. "Martha Henderson has a weak heart, and there's no telling how much longer their house will hold." Bo felt the familiar surge of decision-making, clarity that had once preceded his most dangerous rides. The Henderson place was accessible only by a narrow path that was probably underwater by now, surrounded by terrain that would challenge even an experienced horseman under the best conditions. "I'll go," he said, the words coming automatically. "Despite the obvious impossibility of the situation, Bo," Willa said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of meaning that encompassed everything they hadn't yet discussed. "You can't." The truth of her statement hung in the air like a physical presence. He couldn't wade through floodwater in a wheelchair, couldn't navigate the treacherous path to the Henderson place, couldn't carry two elderly people to safety when he couldn't even carry himself. Unless... Bo looked toward the barn where he'd hidden the makeshift boat he'd been constructing during the long winter evenings, a shallow draft vessel designed for navigating the seasonal streams that crossed their property during spring runoff. He'd built it as much for the challenge as for any practical purpose, but now it represented the only viable solution to an impossible problem. "Michael," he called to the Brennan boy, "bring me those ropes from the barn and the boat. You'll find it covered with canvas near the back wall." The boat was crude but functional, designed to be stable rather than fast, maneuverable rather than elegant. As Bo examined its construction, with the eye of someone whose life might soon depend on its reliability, he felt the old familiar assessment of risk versus necessity that had guided his decisions during his rodeo days. "You can't be serious," Dr. Whitley protested as he realized what Bo was planning. "Even if the boat works, even if you can reach them, how do you expect to get 3 people back safely?" "The same way I've done everything else since my accident," Bo replied, already calculating angles and currents, "by adapting." What followed was perhaps the most audacious engineering solution that Clearwater had ever witnessed, using a system of pulleys and ropes anchored to trees along the route. Bo created a guideline that would allow him to navigate the boat safely despite the current. The boat itself was modified with a seat that would accommodate his wheelchair, allowing him to transfer in and out without assistance. "This is madness," Willa said, as she watched him make final preparations. But her voice carried pride alongside fear, recognition that the man she had married was revealing depths of courage and innovation that even she hadn't fully appreciated. "Maybe," Bo agreed, settling himself into the boat with movements that were becoming smoother as his legs gradually remembered their function. "But it's madness with a purpose." The journey to the Henderson place was a nightmare of swirling water, debris, and currents that seemed determined to drag the small boat away from its intended course. Bo's upper body strength, developed through months of wheelchair use, served him well as he fought to maintain control while following the rope guideline he'd established. The Henderson house, when he finally reached it, was an island of desperate hope surrounded by muddy water that continued to rise with each passing minute. Martha and Henry Henderson stood on their front porch, clutching each other and staring at the approaching boat as if it were an apparition from their prayers. "About time someone showed up," Henry called, with the kind of gallows humor that frontier people used to cope with impossible situations. "We were starting to think we'd have to sprout gills." Getting the elderly couple into the boat required careful coordination and more trust than any of them were comfortable with, but somehow they managed it. Martha Henderson, despite her weak heart, proved surprisingly resilient as she settled into the boat's center while her husband positioned himself to help with balance. The return journey was even more treacherous, weighted down with 3 people, instead of 1, fighting currents that had grown stronger in the brief time Bo had been away. But the rope guideline held, the boat proved seaworthy, and Bo's determination proved stronger than the flood that threatened to claim them all. They reached safety to cheers from the assembled families, but Bo barely heard the celebration. His attention was focused on Willa's face as she helped him from the boat, on the mixture of relief, pride, and something deeper that shone in her eyes. "The Hendersons are safe," Dr. Whitley announced to the group, "thanks to our coordinator's ingenuity and courage," but Bo knew the real test was just beginning. The water was still rising, more people would need evacuation, and the next crisis might require solutions that even his innovative spirit couldn't provide. As he looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who now looked to him not with pity but with respect and trust, Bo realized that the flood had revealed something he hadn't expected. He didn't need to walk to be the man these people needed him to be. He just needed to be himself. The dam break came at dawn, announced by a sound like thunder that wouldn't stop. Bo woke to the vibration traveling through the ground itself, a deep rumble that spoke of catastrophic failure somewhere upstream. Within minutes, riders were arriving with news that confirmed everyone's worst fears. The earthen dam that had held Mill Creek in check for 15 years had given way under the relentless pressure of accumulated rainfall. "Wall of water coming down the valley," gasped young Peterson, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Maybe 20 feet high, moving faster than anything I've ever seen. It'll reach the main creek in less than an hour." The mathematics were brutal and simple. When that water hit the already swollen creek system, it would create a flood of biblical proportions. Everything in the lowlands would be swept away, homes, livestock, and anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its path. Bo's mind raced through the geography of their district, calculating who was in immediate danger and how much time they had to reach them. The Brennan family had moved to high ground the day before, but their nearest neighbors, the Kowalskis, had refused evacuation and were now directly in the flood's path. Worse still, the emergency rope and pulley system he'd created for navigating the flooded areas would be useless against the kind of violent current that was coming. "How many people are still down there?" he asked, already knowing the answer would be too many. "At least a dozen families," Dr. Whitley replied grimly. "The Kowalskis, the Martinez family, old Tom Brennan and his sons who went back for their cattle, maybe more." The solution that came to Bo was audacious even by his standards, requiring split-second timing and a level of coordination that would challenge even experienced rescue teams. But it was also the only chance they had of reaching the trapped families. "Before the floodwater arrived, we're going to use the bell tower," he announced, his voice cutting through the panicked conversations around him. "Not to ring the bell, but as an anchor point for a zip-line system that can get people across the flood zone." What followed was the most frantic construction project in Clearwater's history. Using every rope in the district and a system of pulleys borrowed from the grain elevator, they created a series of suspended lines that stretched from the bell tower to strategic high points across the valley. The improvised zip lines could carry people and supplies across areas that would soon be underwater, bypassing the ground-level transportation that the flood would make impossible. But operating the system required someone to climb the 30-foot tower to coordinate the rescue operations from a position that offered clear sight lines across the entire rescue zone. It required exactly the kind of mobility that Bo's wheelchair had seemed to preclude. Standing at the base of the ladder that led to the tower's platform, Bo felt the weight of every choice he'd made since his accident. He could feel sensation in his legs, could move them with increasing strength and control, but he'd never tested them against the demands of a 30-foot climb with other people's lives hanging in the balance. "I can do it," Willa said quietly. studying the ladder with the practical assessment of someone who'd climbed plenty of barn lofts and windmill towers during her frontier life. "No." Beau's response was immediate and unequivocal. "You have Emma to think about, and this is what they appointed me to do." "Beau," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to them, not to me, not to yourself." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something in her face that took his breath away. It wasn't pity or doubt or fear for his limitations. It was absolute confidence in his ability to find a solution, combined with absolute acceptance of whatever form that solution might take. "I know," he said simply, "but I need to try." The climb was a nightmare of determination over doubt, strength over fear, stubborn will over physical limitation. Beau's legs, weakened by 2 years of disuse but strengthened by months of secret exercise, trembled with effort as he pulled himself up rung by rung. Twice he had to stop and rest, fighting waves of dizziness that threatened to send him plummeting to the ground. But each time he looked down and saw the faces watching him, Willa's proud and terrified, the neighbors hopeful and desperate, he found the strength to continue. From the platform 30 feet above the ground, Beau could see the approaching wall of water, like a brown scar across the valley landscape. He could also see the trapped families, tiny figures clustered on whatever high ground they could find, waiting for rescue that might or might not come in time. "Send the first line," he shouted down to the crews below, his voice carrying clearly. In the morning air, what followed was the most complex rescue operation in the territory's history, coordinated by a man who had learned to turn limitations into innovations, obstacles into opportunities. One by one, families were pulled across the flood zone on improvised zip lines, their rescues timed to the minute as the wall of water bore down on everything in its path. The Kowalski children came first, small bodies trusting completely in the system Beau had designed. Then their parents, Mrs. Kowalski clutching a bag of photographs that represented the only possession she'd been able to save. The Martinez family followed, their faces grim with the knowledge that their home and livelihood were about to disappear beneath the flood. As the last rescue was completed and the wall of water finally reached their location, Beau remained on the platform, coordinating the evacuation of rescue equipment and ensuring that no one was left behind. The flood, when it arrived, was everything the early warnings had promised. A churning mass of water, debris, and destruction that swept away everything in its path. From his perch above the chaos, Beau watched years of hard work disappear in minutes. Homes that families had built with their own hands, barns that had sheltered animals through countless winters, fields that had provided sustenance for entire communities. All of it vanished beneath the relentless water, but everyone was safe. Every family accounted for, every life preserved through a combination of innovative engineering, community cooperation, and the kind of leadership that had nothing to do with the ability to walk, and everything to do with the willingness to take responsibility for other people's welfare. As Beau finally descended the ladder, his legs shaking with exhaustion, but supporting him step by careful step, he found Willa waiting at the bottom, with Emma in her arms, and tears of pride streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered as he reached solid ground. "You saved them all." But Beau, looking around at the community that had come together in crisis, knew that the real salvation had been mutual. They had saved each other, and in doing so, had discovered strengths they'd never known they possessed. 6 months after the Great Flood, Willa stood in the doorway of their rebuilt cabin, watching Beau work in the garden with movements that had become fluid and confident. His legs, strengthened through months of gradual rehabilitation, carried him steadily between the rows of vegetables that had replaced the ones swept away by the spring deluge. The wheelchair sat unused in the barn, a reminder of the man he had been rather than a limitation on the man he had become. The new cabin was larger than the old one, built with lumber donated by grateful families and designed to accommodate the territorial coordinator's expanded responsibilities. A separate office housed the communication equipment that kept Bo connected to emergency networks throughout the region, while a workshop attached to the barn allowed him to continue the leatherwork that had become both artistic expression and practical income. The hand-painted sign that marked their property, McKenna Family Farm, Esther 1892, reflected the transformation that had occurred not just in their land, but in their lives. What had begun as Mrs. Patterson's charitable arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had dared to hope for, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. Rather than breaking apart, Emma, now walking and chattering in the mixture of languages that characterized frontier children, played in the garden dirt while her parents worked. At 18 months, she showed signs of inheriting both her mother's practical intelligence and her father's innovative spirit, already demonstrating an ability to solve problems that would have puzzled children twice her age. "She's going to be a handful," Bo observed, watching Emma construct an elaborate irrigation system for her mud pies, using sticks and stones arranged with surprising precision. "She's going to be extraordinary," Willa corrected, settling her hand on the swell of her belly where their second child was growing. This pregnancy, planned and celebrated rather than feared and hidden, represented the kind of future neither had imagined possible during those awkward early days of their marriage. The territorial position had evolved into something that utilized Bo's strengths while accommodating his history, rather than requiring constant travel and physical demands that might strain his recovering mobility. The role had become one of strategic planning and innovation. His flood response system had been adopted as a model for other districts, and his engineering solutions were being studied by territorial officials looking to improve emergency preparedness throughout the region. More importantly, the respect he had earned during the crisis had translated into a different kind of authority, one based on proven competence rather than physical capability. When Bo McKenna spoke at territorial meetings, people listened not because of what he could do with his body, but because of what he had accomplished with his mind and spirit. The leather business had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, with orders coming from as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. But they had maintained their commitment to quality over quantity, taking only the work that interested them and charging prices that reflected the artistry Bo brought to each piece. The barn workshop had become a gathering place where neighbors brought complex problems requiring innovative solutions, confident that Bo's approach to challenges would yield unexpected answers. Dr. Henley wrote again, Willa mentioned, sorting through the mail that had arrived with the morning supply wagon. "He's still hoping you'll consider coming to Denver for a complete examination." Bo paused in his weeding, considering the letter that had arrived monthly since his recovery became known beyond their district. Dr. Henley's interest was partly medical, a desire to understand how partial paralysis could be overcome through determination and gradual rehabilitation, but also partly personal. The doctor felt responsible for Bo's original disappearance and wanted reassurance that his patient had found peace with the choices he'd made. "Maybe someday," Bo replied, though they both knew he had little interest in becoming a medical curiosity. "Right now, I'm more interested in the life we're building than the life I left behind." The sentiment reflected a wisdom that had emerged from their shared trials. Bo had learned that strength wasn't measured by what a person could do in their prime, but by how they responded when those abilities were challenged. Walking again was a gift, but it was not the source of his worth or the foundation of his identity. Willa had learned her own lessons about the nature of partnership and the difference between loving someone for what they could provide versus loving them for who they chose to be. The man she had married out of desperation had become someone she would choose again without hesitation. not because his circumstances had improved, but because his character had been revealed through adversity. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rebuilt prairie in shades of gold and amber that reminded them both of that first evening when they had sat as strangers trying to navigate an impossible situation. The McKenna family gathered on their porch for the evening ritual that had become their tradition. Bo read aloud from the territorial newspaper, sharing news of the wider world, with voices that carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned to value words as much as actions. Emma listened with the solemn attention of a child who understood that this was important, even if she couldn't yet grasp all the meaning. Willa worked on the blanket for their coming child, her needles clicking, in rhythm with the evening songs of crickets and tree frogs. "Listen to this," Bo said, finding an article that caught his interest. "They're planning to establish a territorial college focused on agricultural innovation and emergency management. They want to interview people who've developed successful community response systems." Willa looked up from her knitting, noting the excitement in his voice. "Are you interested? Maybe. It would mean sharing what we've learned, helping other communities prepare for their own challenges. And it wouldn't require leaving home. Just occasional trips to share knowledge and learn from other people's innovations." The conversation reflected the balance they had achieved between ambition and contentment, between the desire to make a difference and the commitment to preserve what they had built together. Bo's recovery had opened new possibilities, but it had also deepened his appreciation for the life they had created when possibilities seemed limited. As the stars emerged in the vast prairie sky, their light joining the warm glow from the cabin windows, the McKenna family prepared for another night in the home they had built together. Emma fell asleep in Bo's arms, her small body trusting completely in his strength and protection. Willa settled into the rocking chair that had witnessed the evolution of their marriage, from awkward arrangement to genuine partnership. "Do you ever think about what Mrs. Patterson intended when she arranged our marriage?" Willa asked, her voice soft in the evening quiet. Bo considered the question, thinking of the woman whose charitable impulses had set their story in motion. "I think she meant well, in her way. She saw two broken people and thought they might help each other survive. She couldn't have known we'd do more than survive." "No," Bo agreed, looking around at the life they had created together, the home, the family, the community respect, the work that gave meaning to their days. "She couldn't have known we'd thrive." The word hung in the evening air like a benediction, carrying with it the weight of all they had overcome and the promise of all they might still become. They had started as strangers, bound together by circumstance and desperation. They had become partners, then friends, then lovers, and finally, family in the truest sense of the word. Outside, the Dakota wind sang its eternal song of endurance and possibility. Inside the cabin, two people who had learned that love could grow from the most unlikely soil settled into sleep, surrounded by the evidence of a life built not on perfection, but on the willingness to keep trying, keep adapting, keep finding ways to be better tomorrow than they had been today. In the morning, there would be new challenges to face, new problems to solve, new opportunities to serve their community and build their future. But tonight, they rested in the knowledge that they had become more than the sum of their individual limitations. They had become proof that with enough determination, creativity, and love, any obstacle could be transformed into the foundation for something beautiful. The pregnant widow and the paralyzed cowboy had indeed become the pride of the plains, not through the restoration of what they had lost, but through the creation of something entirely new and entirely their own.